Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Work in Progress with me, ProxyDamage. I had actually a lot of topics to talk about this week. I could have talked about the hunters, the current meta, the games that we just had, like the return of the SPL, the new character, Ratatorsker, or whatever you call him. But in the end of the day, I went with the topic I think is more current or that everybody's talking more about. Because at the end of the day, like for example, Ratatorsker is basically a beta yet because it's still in the beta server, so it's entirely possible that it's going to change a fair bit before we see him again in the final server. So I'll save the conversation for then. Instead, I want to talk about hunters because, in my opinion, there's a bit of a misunderstanding regarding hunters, right? A lot of people are saying hunters are overpowered or that they're ridiculous and stuff like that. And I sort of agree to a certain point. We're definitely seeing a lot more hunters, and to some degrees they are a bit skewed in where they should, but it's not the hunters. Like most hunters, like have not actually been touched. Like maybe Neath has been buffed. Like Engur was just rebuffed because he was nerfed to begin with. So most hunters actually went down in their power since like season 1. It's just everything else that happened around them, and that's what I want to talk about. So like before I talk about anything else, let's talk about what hunters, or in more traditional in MOBAs, AD carries are supposed to be, ranged carries. They were originally designed as characters that like they were very weak early in the game. They were like generally very fragile, very weak. They didn't have a lot of mobility. They weren't very safe characters. And they didn't really hit very hard because they specialize in ranged basic attacks, the bow and arrow, the sniper, whatever. And early game, you don't have critical hits, you don't have a lot of power, attack speed, you don't have items, so they start off really weak. Sorry, really weak and really fragile. They were like fairly low mobility, fairly limited defense, like the first AD carries in most games are. If you most MOBAs right now, like Ashe in League of Legends, Artemis in Smite, like they were more dangerous if you want. It was more dangerous to play those characters. And the trade-off, of course, was that as the game progressed, you got more and more items, and you get to late game, and you have this character that can hit things from range, so it can stay relatively safe compared to others. And it's gonna do the equivalent of a mage nuke per auto attack without needing cooldowns. They're basically just attacking. They have no restriction. They can just attack as much as they want, which gives them a ridiculous damage output in the late game, as everybody knows who has played MOBAs. So that was the trade-off, and that's why that was like one of the big reasons why you put them with supports in the beginning, like with in most MOBAs, because they were fragile, they were very easy to gank, very easy to pressure early. So you put them with you put them with another character to help them survive. That the support was dedicated to basically saving them in the early game. Just let them farm. That was what the support did. Sorry. But that's not necessarily what happens right now, especially in Smite, as most of you are probably aware. Most of you play Smite after all. Nowadays, the character design in Hunters, or in AD carries, or in ranged carries, ranged basic attack centric characters, has changed significantly, right? You have. It started a few years ago, if you want, it started a few years ago. Hunters got more mobility. They got more defense. You have characters like Ezreal in League of Legends. You have characters like Apollo in Smite. In fact, if you look at all the new hunters in Smite, it's like a prerequisite to have some sort of mobility and defense mechanism. You have OE as the Air Jordan spacewalk. You have Medusa has the Mad Dash as the ultimate, which is a large, very potent CC. They all became better defensively, right? You have Uller, which has a movement speed steroid, a stun, and a really long range jump. All of those things. So one of their initial fragilities, or one of their initial faults, if you want, was removed by design, and that's okay. That is an evolution in the game, I think, because it's generally more interesting to have characters that can do that, because then they're not restricted to that lane where someone has to babysit them 24/7 or they die. right? They can become more of a relevant character. Like you can take them in solo lane, you can take them in other lanes, on the solo lane in general, whatever it is, you can take them in other places. Sorry about that. But this did remove one of their initial problems, which was that early danger of running one of these characters. Another thing happened meanwhile, and that is Smite specific, which is itemization. That changed a lot since season 1, since a few months ago, really. I mean, itemization in Smite, I'm just gonna outright say it, is fairly poor, right? I've mentioned it before, I've mentioned it several times, I'm probably gonna talk about it again, but especially for hunters, itemization is very limited, right? In season 1, you at least had two different core paths, which was the traditional crit build, and you had the unicorn build started by Cret, popularized by Ataraxia and such, and Suntouch, if I remember correctly, which was based, instead of having crits, which is the traditional basic attack multiplier, you focused your build on maximizing penetration, having higher attack speed, and using the Sheen size passive, which does percentage of maximum health per hit. So you worked differently. It was a different build, and you itemized differently. It had different strengths, different weaknesses. They had a different path. Now, for better or worse, that option is no longer available. You can no longer max penetration. Sheen size was nerfed. Whatever happened in the rest of the game for hunters, that was strictly bad because now they don't have that option. So we went back to having one option, which is critical. Just a crit path, you have to build Rage and Deathbringer. And again, I've mentioned this over and over and over. I'm not going to go in detail with it again, but the point is that basically you have one build, and if you do balance changes to the items, unless they're really significant, and then you just have a new better build, what you have is that the top build will always be the more efficient one mathematically, right? Right now is the Heartseeker into Aussie Rush. We'll go into that. So because of that, for a long time you had the now old build, which was the Devourer's Gauntlet into Ishaival or whatever it's called, etc., etc. And because everybody was playing it, Hi-Rez wanted to change it because they wanted to give hunters another option, which is a very good thing to do, except the way they went about it, in my opinion, is wrong, which is they nerfed that. They nerfed the Varus gauntlets, and they buffed the competitor, which was a Heartseeker. The result is that they simply switched places. You switched Heartseeker for... Heartseeker is basically just better than the Varus Gauntlet as a first power item. It's more efficient, and because of that, you need a lifesteal item, which removes the Cheval. Lifesteal attack speed item is Azi. So there you go, new standard. Simple. This created a different problem. One of the old problems of hunters, if you still remember, was that their itemization was expensive. Like they need items to do anything. The basic attacks are just as relevant as anyone else's basic attacks at the beginning of the game. Nothing, not very. So now, what is the new core for hunters? The first items: Heartseeker, super crazy cheap. Azi, crazy cheap. Boots, all practically free. And Executioner, really cheap. So the first 4 items hunters are gonna build are among the cheapest items in the game. Most of their build is incredibly cheap. So these characters that if they get late game status have incredibly high power level, more than half of their build is really stupid cheap. I think you're starting to see where this is going. What happened is that over time, like hunters lost their design fragility of being easier to gank and easier to just rush down and kill. And now their itemization is super cheap. So after mid game, come about 15 minutes or so, they're most of their build in. They have most of their build. That's it. Like they have accelerated to a point where they're fairly equivalent to most other characters in just raw damage output. So they're if the game keeps going, they're gonna get to the point where they're the late game monsters that they were picked for. It's uneven. The scales are uneven, right? There's another factor as well here that people don't account for, which is secondary or other compounding issues that have nothing to do with hunters, but that benefit them. The loss of penetration on mages, for example, the pen boots. In the late game, it's not as impactful as all that, especially for mages that go the Obsidian Shard route, because Obsidian Shard isn't particularly effective with flat penetration. Is it? Yeah, no, it's fine. Never mind. It's still impactful, but it's not as much, right? What's very impactful is that in the early and mid game, they don't have penetration. Mages don't have penetration now in the early and mid game. Some mages will rush spear, which gives them that, but it's still less than before. And in the early games, it matters a lot because before you could basically do true damage or almost. Now you still get mitigated, and it makes a big difference. It makes those flat 10 penetration make way more difference to most characters than the 60 power you can get, right? Than the 30 extra power that you get in those boots or whatever. Mages were the early and mid game contests, if you want. They were the early and mid game powerhouses that carried the game over until the late game hunters kicked in, right? Like, generally speaking, you take that away. You take away, like, not only have you accelerated the hunters' early power spike, you've made it cheaper, easier to get, but now you also made their number one enemies, if you want, other than assassins, like the number one people that were contesting for the early and mid game damage spot, which were mages. You made them weaker because you removed the penetration. Another one was the Witchblade nerf. Witchblade got seriously nerfed, and Witchblade was the primary anti-hunter item, anti-any basic attack character, and hunters are basic attackers. So you do all of those things. You can also argue that maybe indirectly because of the Frostbound Hammer and Heavy Hammer becoming a bigger thing. That started in the last season, but sort of became bigger and bigger nowadays. And that now with Frostbound Hammer it might affect carries more because the attack speed slow, but especially Heavy Hammer with the slow might affect mages more, arguably, because hunters are going to build speed immunity in sprint anyways, so they can just trigger that and have several seconds of ignoring the slow outright, and they generally have hunters generally have hard mobility more than just movement speed boosts, other than sprint, but that's slow immune. So again, more pressure on mages, less on hunters. So at the end of the day, is this a problem for the meta? I think the itemization issues in general are a problem for the meta, but that's a different issue. Are hunters in a bad spot? Probably. Like, I'm one of the more conservative people when it comes to calling things OP or OP, overrated or underrated. I think I think the scales have been tilted pretty far in this one, right? And yeah, but you're not gonna fix it by nerfing Hunter specifically. You're gonna fix it by changing itemization, by giving fucking mages their penetration back, 'cause it makes sense, right? That's a different topic. But it makes sense on mages. Not on physical characters, because they abused it too well through the game. But on mages it did. Whatever, different issue. But you're gonna fix it through itemization. You're gonna fix it through all of those things, and not just saying, oh, nerf Neath or Ainur or whatever. You can fix it by game mechanics as well, because one of the things that hunters in Smite have, that hunters in, for example, League don't have, is that they all, by necessity, almost all have very good clear. Even characters like Shibalanke and Cupid, who have atrocious clear compared to most other hunters, especially someone like Ainur who just throws a spear and clears it, or Medusa. they have fairly bad clear compared to them, but they have very good clear nonetheless, right? And you get golden experience by just things dying, whereas in, for example, League, you have to get the last hit, which means that in general it's going to be easier to get to that late game status because it's harder to deny anything from the character. You have to basically push them to the tower. And that's again secondary things. You can fix all of those things, but at the end of the day, itemization is going to be the key. You can't. If It's very important to have alternate paths, alternate build core options. I'm behind that 100%. I've written about it a billion times. But that's not going to come down to, oh, this item is being used, nerf it. This item isn't being used, buff it, because then they just switch places. That's going to happen the same thing again. And right now, what you have is that hunters are by design safer, and itemization is really cheap. 4 of the hunters' items are crazy, crazy, crazy cheap. I'm fairly certain like 3 of them at least are, if not the cheapest items in the game, they're probably in the top 5 of the cheapest, which is boots. Boots are like the cheapest items right now, and then Azi and Heartseeker, which if I remember correctly, they're both like around 1800 gold. That's not even 2000 gold for 2 major items, and they're really strong. So, uh, what? Yeah. So, what are your thoughts, you guys listening to me, on? I want to hear from you guys on the show. Is it improving? Is it not stale? Not good? What do you guys want me to improve from here on? Topics that you want to talk. If you want me to talk about anything specific, or you want me to answer some questions, leave them on the comments. I'll answer on the next episode or something. And I'd like to hear your opinions on the current meta and all the whole Hunter issue and everything. That's it for now. Hope you guys enjoyed. Signing off.